Hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. My name is Emma. I'm here today with the magnificent Kellyanne.
Thank you, Emma.
And the wonderful Kelly.
Hello.
And the stupendous Brent of ex.patriarch. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you. Very happy to be here today with you.
We're so happy to have you. So, listeners, we're here today with Brent McCleary. He is a TikToker. If you haven't seen his amazing TikToks on his page, ex.patriarch, then you are missing out. He is also a future podcaster, which is very exciting. I personally cannot wait to listen. But right now, we're going to listen to what Brent has to say about all things misogyny, all things feminism, all things toxic masculinity, because that's what this dude does. So let's just dive right in. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine. So, Brent, we are all ecstatic to have you here. Thank you so much for so generously giving us your time and being like, yes, I'll come on this gals podcast, podcast.
The easiest person to schedule,
Honestly,
think that we've ever worked with.
That is true. Guys, I just reached out to him on DMs. And immediately he was like, I could schedule a call today. And I was like, whoa, like
too soon, too much.
Too soon. But I appreciate the eagerness. You're just so kind and responsive. But to kind of paint the picture, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the community that you've created on TikTok, because you're doing really cool things.
Well, appreciate that. I think that's the thing is I feel very much like I'm not doing great things. I'm just a normal guy, right? I am a father. I'm a software engineer. I am a fiance. And I kind of started last year just making content calling out some of the misogynistic talking points that I was seeing on social media, right? There's a lot of conversation that is happening, a lot of kind of men putting out these social media posts and videos talking about how women are this and that. And I knew a lot of it was not real. Like it was not based off my experience as a father, having gone through like family court and things like that. And so I wanted to start making content, just calling some of that out. And that started last year. And since then that has basically taken off. And that's been my entire platform on social media has been calling out those misogynistic talking points, but also educating about toxic behaviors in men and talking about toxic masculinity and how we can address it. Just wanting to help counter that narrative and to help those who might be younger men or a lot of mothers with young sons in helping them to kind of sort through the misinformation and nonsense and get to what is real and to help those men, you know, have happier and healthier lives.
I love that. I'm curious, like, why do you think you've blown up?
I think it's two things. Is like the big one is the one that I feel the most uncomfortable with, right? Is that it is so rare to see a man who is openly advocating for women, who is being an ally, not just to women, but also to LGBTQ and talking about it. Very rare do you find somebody who's not invested in those communities, advocating and talking for them. So to find a white man essentially talking on this stuff is rare. And I think that's exciting for a lot of people. They love to see it and they want more of it. The thing that surprised me about TikTok, it is a very short format social media. You make 1-minute videos, and most of my videos, as you've probably seen as you've watched, are long-winded. They're 3 minutes long, they're 5 minutes long, they're packed with a lot of facts, a lot of studies. And I think there's just an appetite in that conversation for getting back to talking about what's real, talking about what data says, moving away from kind of reactionary feelings on a topic and actually, kind of coming to this common ground of like, well, what's the reality? What's the actual situation, and basing our viewpoints off that.
Yeah, that's so impactful, because I think it's like you said, in a world where it's like a 30 or 60 second clip and it's very emotions driven, having that like factual grounding, I think is so important.
Yeah, and I would like to just point out, I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the podcast, but the number of white, straight, cis men that have approached us and asked, hey, are you going to do an episode on toxic masculinity? And we've been like, yeah, we really want to. We just haven't found the right person to interview. And they've been like, how about me? is astounding.
Yeah. And it's like, what about you? Do you ever talk about, like, do you have any background or research?
Show
do you
me
do
your
anything?
receipts. I don't know.
They're like just dudes
Yeah,
that we just
gross.
like know or meet. People we barely know.
Yeah. People we don't know.
Yeah.
Literally.
Like, people who, just think that this topic needs to be talked about, and they're the ones. And so what I'm trying to say here is it's really refreshing. I feels like we finally found a white cis straight man to come talk about these topics. But you have the receipts, right? You've done the work. You're very research-based. You're very facts-based. And we can definitely see like a history of being an ally and advocate for women and for marginalized groups. And that's fantastic. This is exactly what we were looking for. So for any of our wonderful friends, acquaintances, or people that don't know us at all who are listening today because you really wanted an episode on toxic masculinity, this is the candidate that we have chosen.
No pressure for me. Okay, I got you.
But it is so funny that like I don't know. This is just even a side tangent. So often it's all about like, well, I don't want women to get jobs because they're women. I want that because they're qualified. But then we get the complete opposite. Anyways, I'll just move on.
Then we get
just an
men
observation.
who get jobs because they're in the boys' club or because they're friends with people. Or
anyways, it's staggering. But I'm curious, with all of that in mind, from your perspective, what does toxic masculinity mean, and why is it a problem?
That's great. That's a good question. I think, there's a fear that a lot of time when we have this conversation that all masculinity is under attack. And I think that's often been the reaction of men. And anything that is toxicity is the amount or degree at which something becomes harmful or damaging, right? Everything has a toxicity, even water. If you drink too much of it, it's going to cause you health problems if you drink too much too quickly. And so that's the same really we're talking about with masculinity. It is not harmful in of itself. It is not a problem in of itself. But when it's dialed up and concentrated and ratcheted up in the intensity, it can lead to antisocial behaviors that then are harmful, both to the men who display those behaviors and also to the people around them. Think of the man who, has a pain but won't go to the doctor. Oh, I'm fine. It's all right. Whatever. I don't want to bother anybody.
I'm tough.
And then, something ruptures and then they have to go to the emergency room. Now it's a much more costly and dangerous incident. Or the man who bottles up all these emotions and they have all their fear, their pain, and their anger latched in until they lash out, right? That's really what we're talking about. As to why it's a problem, though, like 80% of all violent crime is perpetrated by men. 99% of all sexual assault is perpetrated by men. 3 women every single day are killed by a current or former intimate partner. And in fact, 90% of all female murder victims are killed by a man that they know. And it's not just women that are at risk, even children too. There was a recent study published by the Center for Judicial Excellence talking about how a child dies every 6 days, killed by a divorcing or separating parent, and the vast majority of those, 70% of them, are the fathers of that child. But it's not just the other people around them that men are a danger to. They're a danger to themselves, because suicide is often talked about in this context and in these conversations, and it is the number 2 leading killer of men after accidental death of men under 40. It's only at 40 that heart disease and cancer gets a chance to catch up. But that starts at age 15, right? And that is just horrific. I mean, post-COVID, to me, maybe I'm invested because I'm a man, but it feels like the violence that men do to others and to themselves is possibly the biggest health crisis that we're facing and that we need to address and do something about for everybody's safety. I mean, it's a huge risk.
That's such a great answer. I love that. It feels very like, no, here are the facts, here are the things. The point being that masculinity is not toxic. But there are traits of masculinity, or maybe concentrations of masculinity, that have caused a lot of harm. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about toxic masculinity. On the other hand, what is positive masculinity, or what is healthy masculinity from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of the conversation of feminism over the past, 200 years has moved in to help women lead more fulfilling, more purpose-driven lives, to be happier in their relationships. And we've really seen that, just blossom in the lives that women lead now versus the ones 200 years ago. They're given a lot more freedom, a lot more initiative, a lot happier. We're still not there. Like, it's hard when you're still working a 9 to 5 to be like, hey, am I happy?
Yeah.
But that conversation, I think, has left men behind because it has been focused. And I think men are now facing a world in which that doesn't look anything like that. They're still being told that, you can go out and go get a blue collar job and raise a family, and you have a wife who stays at home and raises kids. And that's just not possible. It's not possible on those jobs anymore. So this dream that they have been sold throughout their lives and that their parents had and their grandparents just isn't a reality for them. And they're coming into that realization into society and feeling like complete failures because they're not meeting that expectation and don't know how to address it. And I think positive masculinity is about helping those men navigate that by showing them good role models, showing them how to create relationships that are fulfilling and that they can find their purpose in, and help them to navigate through their emotional resilience, being able to openly talk about their emotions and deal with their problems and realize that they are not an island, they are not alone, and they are not isolated, and that they can talk to their friends and other men about their experiences and gain that support that they need to navigate the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's sort of a growing conversation about how women in the wake of feminism have become so much more self-reliant and independent and autonomous in their economic status and their relational status. And the men have almost not necessarily been nurtured in that way, and so we're seeing things that are showing, a loneliness epidemic among men where most men don't have more than one good friend or don't have any good deep friendships. And we're seeing women more and more find close community and build trust with one another and almost go, well, what is the point of a heterosexual marriage relationship when I have such supportive, loving community outside of that? And, I can raise children if I want without the support of a man, and I can have a career without the support of a man, and I can, get rich or chase my dreams without the support of a man. And so we have this sort of like chasm between the benefits of what feminism has done in women and the lack of, I guess, attention that's been paid to men who haven't necessarily done the work to increase domestic labor, emotional labor, and learn how to come into a more equitable relationship and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's interesting because it's kind of like we're in such flux as a culture in between like this era of the housewife versus now there's this like sticky middle of we have all of this independence and advantage for women, although it's still not enough, I would argue. But men are still being given the same messaging that they were given 100 years ago. It's incongruent. Like, it reminds me actually of like how we were taught about like economics growing up. Like it was like, oh, you'll be able to grow up, get a good like if you go to college and get a good job, maybe not even have to go to college, you'll get a good job, work hard, and you'll buy a house in your 20s and you'll be good to go. That's not a reality anymore in the United States, at least. Like that's just not the way that it works. And so there's so many like millennials or even Gen Zers now that are like, what the hell? Like, I know this is not the way that the world actually works, but I was told that it was. And I think it's similar when you look at how the patriarchy is impacting men and holding on to the patriarchal ideals. Then there's a cruel wake-up call because our nation and much of the cultures around the world are in this flux of transitioning towards more empowerment of women, but we're figuring out how to move forward, it feels like.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder, too, as we're describing the evolution of economics, and we've all mentioned, like, you can't afford to have that life anymore, right? But men, pretty broadly, that life meaning, I'll back up. The life meaning having the job, the stay-at-home wife, you can buy a house, you can raise the kids, you can go on vacation once a year.
The American dream.
The American dream, right? And that is not the reality in the United States. But also, like, men are being told that can be their reality. So I would imagine there's a lot of pent-up frustration, and they probably feel like failures because it's like, well, I'm being told I can do this, but it's not happening for me. So I'm failing my whatever you is in your life, your family, your wife, your job, your whatever. And so it's like, yeah, I guess that would breed a lot of frustration and violence and etc.
And I would say like women are in the same boat, right? I think especially us millennials as products of the 90s, we grew up with the messaging that as women, you can be whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. If you get an education, if you study hard enough, if you work hard enough, you're just as capable as any man to succeed. And when the first time your face smacks up against that glass ceiling, it's a rude awakening to how untrue that is, especially in the corporate world in America. And so women are now, I think, figuring out how to forge their own pathways, which is amazing. And there's tons of progress happening there. But it was really frustrating for me to find out that just because my church leaders, let's say, or my teachers offered me this vision of my future doesn't mean that it was true. I think it was idealistic. And it didn't necessarily acknowledge the systemic issues that were in place. And so, yeah, we were all in for a rude awakening when we grew up. And now we're all trying to sort through what happened and what is, the way forward.
Yeah. I think we're all trying to make sense of it, which is why what you do is so helpful.
Yes, totally.
So, Brent, there are some very successful influencers such as Pearl, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate. I think of, is it the Whatever Show or Whatever podcast where they have that group of people that are spewing hate about women. And I'm really curious to see or to hear what are some of the arguments that you're hearing from people like this and that you're coming up against the most. Like, what are the main things?
So I think mostly all of it forms a pattern, right? In that they want to paint a picture that all women are vain, vacuous, selfish, materialistic, and love to hurt men for fun. So let me show you how you go out and form a successful relationship with that person. And to me, that is the most crazy thing ever. Like, if they truly believed what they were saying about women and how, irredeemable and terrible women were, why would you want to chain yourself to that person and build a relationship with that person? And I think when you dig past the surface, a lot of them, especially Pearl, Jordan Peterson, what they're really looking for is, like we talked about there, that traditional dynamic of they're really advocating for relationships where the man is the patriarch of the household, controls the finances, brings home, he's the breadwinner, and the woman is very subservient to that and stays at home and raises a family. And they see anything that threatens that as problematic and call that out. And so I think that's what mostly I come up against. And I think it's largely about educating that what we're trying to do and the whole progressive movement isn't about eliminating that as an option. If that is what you want, if you find a partner who is amenable to that life and that's the life you guys want to build together, that is an acceptable option. The issue is trying to paint it as the only acceptable option.
Yeah.
Or the men who allow themselves to be in another dynamic where they're not the breadwinner, where men who stay at home, right? One of the things that was very important for me when we had our child was that I wanted to make sure that I was very involved. My father was very involved with me. Even after my parents divorced, my father still took me every weekend. I still saw him. Very easy to be the weekend parent. But even then, I'm still like, oh, I'm so grateful for that because a lot of fathers do disappear.
Yeah.
I've done videos on it talking about how like even 60% of the men who have high contact, who have like weekly contact with their kids, will eventually ghost them within 8 years. It's ridiculous. But trying to make sure that men understand that that is acceptable. Like, you should be involved with your kids and you should be pushing for that. And it does make it hard. If you're trying to bring home incomes and navigate that in this reality where, it's very difficult to be a single income family. You really need to do too. And then how do you manage those responsibilities? Because most of their content is about if there's any kind of discussion or acceptance of that, then you're a failure and you're not enough of a man and all of this. And I think we really need to get away from that you are still every much, a successful member of that relationship, a member of that household, even if, your contribution is doing dishes or doing other household chores, or if you're taking the children and things like that, that is really what we're advocating for, creating a more healthy balance in that relationship, in your work-life balance, and being present to all of the members of your family. And I don't think that is a particularly, bad message to spread to people. Like, that's what we should be wanting, right? You want to look back at the end of your life and have a family around you who felt that you were present and you were there. So many of the men that I talk to, they talk about all of this stuff and this is the life they want. And they talk about the relationship with their fathers and they're very broken. Their fathers were very distant. Their fathers were emotionally absent. And a lot of them were like, well, when I have kids, I'm not going to be like that man. But because they have no other role model and they have no other pattern to model themselves after, what happens is as pressure builds and as they feel that frustration and tension, they just slip into the patterns that they remember from childhood and end up becoming the fathers that they did not want to be. And that is, I think, a very tragic thing for men to experience and go through.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I saw a video on Instagram from Conscious Lee, if you've heard of him. He, it was like reposting a different video, but it showed a woman interviewing these like 13-year-old boys that were on the street and was like, what would you look for in a woman? And these boys were like, one of them was like, oh, she needs to like be able to clean. And another boy was like, she needs to be good at cooking. And another boy goes, she needs to not be too loud, like just stay quiet. And it's like, I think you're describing a servant. Like you're describing a live-in nanny. And she even said, so you want a mother, you want someone to be your mom. And they were like, oh, I don't know, kind of. And they even kind of admitted to it. But I think about that when you talk about the messaging that these people put out that talks about how awful women are in their view, and how it feels like a lot of the messaging is women are good for only a handful of things. And that's the handful. Like they're there for, service, whether it's cooking, cleaning, or sexual pleasure, and that's it. And it's just like such a gross and objectifying way to think about another human.
Well, especially when it's in the context of this is their evolutionary purpose or this is their God-given purpose or whatever, because it's really narrowing in terms of how women are viewed and like the humanity in them almost.
Right. Which is why I think it's important to go back to like, the studies and the data on this stuff, right? Because we know historically that was not the case, right? We know there are a number of hunter-gatherer cultures where the women were out there hunting just as much as the men. And oftentimes in some of those hunter-gatherer tribes, we're actually bringing in the majority of the food. Yeah. Not the men, right? But their whole narrative is all about men bring home the resources and women do everything else. And you're talking about there about young children, like having a teenager myself. This is why it becomes so important for me to talk about it. Like I talk about all the content I make with him and I show him my videos and we have those conversations because I know that those conversations are going on at school. Like his friends are listening to like Andrew Tate and it's attractive. It's seductive. He has a fast Bentley and he has all these beautiful models. And they think that that's real, right? You don't realize that the women are there because they've been paid, right? Like, these men like to create this glamorous lifestyle, but it's all fraud and it is not the sustainable life that you are going to build, right? When you build a relationship, when you talk about what a marriage looks like, the hard work of putting in the 20 years of a successful relationship, none of it looks like what they talk about. They never talk about how do you deal with conflict in a relationship. They don't talk about how do you allow yourselves to be open and emotionally available. And these are all the skills that I think those young men need. And this is why they're facing that isolation and loneliness because they haven't learned to navigate that and then nobody's teaching them.
Yeah, absolutely. In the morning, it does not matter if your spouse brings you 2 coffees, regardless if you need the other one, right? That's Andrew Tate's thing. Right. He's like, she should always bring me 2 coffees, even if I don't touch the other one. It's like, no, are you happy waking up next to the person that you are with? Like, do you enjoy your life together? Are you safe? Do you feel like you can show up mutually and express yourself and express your feelings? Like, those are the things that actually make a relationship, not the silly little things you like bringing your spouse 2 coffees in the morning. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Plus, also, Andrew, you have so much money. You can DoorDash yourself 2 coffees. You do not need a lady there to make them for you.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. And I do really worry about the impact of things like that on a younger generation, because like you said, they might not necessarily realize it's all produced. But I'm pretty sure, isn't he actually in jail now?
he was on home arrest for a while, and I think now they've let him off home arrest, so he can go out and about. He can go visit, but he has to stay in Romania.
I assume maybe awaiting trial.
Yeah. Well, I hope they stream that one from the courtroom, because then all the boys will see, this is not that fun, actually, and I should stay away from this. That would be helpful.
The whole reason he ended up in Romania in the first place was because there were women in the UK who had accused him, and he was pulled in and arrested then. Or, well, not arrested, but he was pulled in and they detained him for a night. And then after that, he was like, ooh, this is dicey.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Romania. So,
Well, and Andrew Tate's easy to, I would say, point the finger at, but he's obviously like a very extreme example. But I feel like he represents maybe a rhetoric of this like alpha male type, and this idea that like in order to be respected, in order for women to want you, in order to gain wealth and affluence, you have to carry this sort of alpha, I don't know, persona with you, which is based on, I mean, we found more and more based on unfactual studies of animals and things. But do you think that, like, is that the ideal that's being sold? Like, what is it that is attractive about being an asshole? Like Andrew Tate, like, why would you ever want to be him? That's my question.
So I think it's the same thing that we've seen from men, like, for decades, right? I think it's just changed slightly what we view and our role models. But we've always had the role models who were famous, rich, party lifestyle with lots of women. And whether that was you were a rock star and you made rock music, whether that's you were a movie star, whether that's that you were a successful gym bro and you're selling all your supplements, like they all have the same kind of the view. But the thing to me is always, they talk about this line they use a lot, right? You don't ask a fish how to catch a fish. You ask the fisherman. But they're asking the most unsuccessful fishermen ever. None of them have been in long-term relationships. None of them have been successfully married for 20 or 30 years. Why are you not looking to those people as your role models for how to build a relationship? If you're truly wanting to actually build a sustaining life with somebody who cares about you, look to the men who have those kind of relationships. And none of them will tell you that the way to do it is to be an alpha male asshole who doesn't care about anybody and doesn't show the least bit of empathy. And they will tell you the exact opposite every single time. That it's about caring deeply for the other people. It's about putting their needs first. And it's living that almost that subservient lifestyle to them of putting other people's needs before yours. And I think that runs so counter and terrifies these men so much that they cannot touch it because it feels feminine, which ties back into toxic masculinity, right? The idea that if you have emotions or if you touch into some of these feminine emotions, that somehow makes you less of a man, when in fact, it's more likely to make you more successful as a man. You will be more appealing to other people as a romantic partner because you're putting these things in, and you will lead a happier life. And I think that's really what we've got to try to flip around and really explain and make sure that these young men understand that.
Yeah, I concur to that. And I can give a very practical example. This has been a very hard past week for me, emotionally, physically, all the things. And my husband has stepped up. He has literally gotten all the groceries, cleaned the house, allowed me to literally go to bed at like 8 p.m. if that's what I need to do. He's been so caring and gentle and tender with me, and it is so hot. So I'm like, if you want a wife or a girlfriend or anyone, if you want anyone to be all over you, be tender and kind towards them. It is so attractive. And like, oh my gosh, you can show up in that tender space and let me literally fall apart. And he's like, I got you, babe. And I'm like, ooh, that to me, there's nothing stronger. Actually, there's nothing more attractive or more even masculine and feminine, right? Like, because we both have qualities of the masculine and the feminine, and it's important to have both. But I just am like, I concur 100%.
Yeah. Real proof right there.
Real proof.
Yeah. And I think as we talk more and more about toxic masculinity, I feel like another way to say it could just be insecure masculinity, because there's so much just like fear that you're going to like lose your masculinity, or that you're gonna seem a little bit feminine or seem a little gay, quote unquote. Like that is a constant fear amongst like these hyper masculine men, that you're going to appear like less of an alpha. And it's just so insecure. And that's at the core of it, kind of the opposite of what they're claiming to be. And real security comes from that comfortability with your feminine side, that comes from the comfortability of being able to like, you know, do the quote unquote gatherer tasks and clean your house and do the cooking or get groceries or like simple things, which also for the record, I don't know who decided that a gatherer was less than a hunter, even though we have established that like the hunter-gatherer thing was not really a male-female thing the way we thought it was. You're still using like so much intelligence and resourcefulness to gather food, to make sure you're not getting poisonous food, to make sure you're getting things that are going to taste good, that you are like know where to find the different crops that are going to grow. Anyways, there's a lot of intelligence that comes with gathering that I just think, and then also on top of that, my parallel is that there's so much work that goes into like maintaining a household. Especially as a single person, I'm like often overwhelmed by the fact that like I have to do it all by myself and I don't have somebody who's like helping me do it. It's a lot of like, oh, this is all on one person. And the idea that that is like somehow lesser when it's split between two people and one person happens to be the person maintaining the house more or maintaining the home life is ridiculous. It's just something that doesn't happen to make money. And I think that's one of the differentiators that people use for it. But the person who's making the money wouldn't be able to if that other person wasn't filling in those roles. They just wouldn't. Or they would be overwhelmed.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something that, you know, is one of the talking points, right, of these misogynistic creators, is they talk a lot about that, right? That women get to stay home, right? You get a roof for your food over your head. And I think it's, again, one of the things I've called out in my videos is talking about if you actually totaled up the costs of the childcare and the work that is actually being done in the home, you wouldn't be able to do it off the two people's salaries. Like you couldn't both work and have somebody come in and take those tasks professionally for you. So in fact, you're actually getting a bargain. You're devaluing the labor of the person who stays at home, whether that be the wife or the husband or, other relationships, whoever it is that stays at home, their work, you can only sustain that household through them taking that sacrifice and devaluing it. And that's before we even talk about like, they're not putting money into a 401k. They're not, advancing their career. So there's no increased earning potential for them. It's a huge deal and a huge sacrifice. And I think, again, I went through that with a stay-at-home mom, and I didn't know about all of these things. And so when we got divorced, that put her in a difficult position, and we had to work through that. And it's something, we've still had conversations now years later that we're talking about how she gets to a place where she can sustain herself and stuff like that. And, I think those are conversations we should probably have had going into that. And I wish we had been smarter and more aware of those things so we could have done those things.
Yes. All these things within culture that are circulating. This has been years and years in the making, right? Our generation has kind of just been handed this mess to like unravel. But how do you think we counter them? Like, how do we encourage men to let go of the toxic masculinity? How do we create equality in ways that everyone can show up and bring their gifts and their skills and their talents?
Yeah, that is a huge question. I think it's one
so fix patriarchy for us right now.
You would know. You're a man.
Look, you got us into this mess. It's time for white men to get us out of it. Yeah, I got you.
We believe in you.
I think that's one thing that we're all struggling with. And I think it's not just how do we solve it, but I think it's hard to get people to even listen to the message. One of the things that is very obvious is when creators kind of appeal into and lean into that toxic masculinity, they're very celebrated. But, you mentioned Pearl. I don't know what it is she said recently, but there are a lot of those men now that are turning on Pearl because at some point she didn't toe the line. She said something in this place and then everybody turned on her. And I think that's the difficulty in reaching a lot of these men is the moment that you deviate from the accepted narrative, they switch off. They don't want to listen. And so it's very difficult to even get that message out. I think how do we fix it, I think, is more about our one-on-one interpersonal relationships outside of the internet, because I think the internet is kind of geared and tailored towards this fake lifestyle, these reactionary 60-minute, very emotional arguments. Whereas in reality, the relationships we build, like as a father to my son, right? He sees what a good man looks like. He sees it on a daily basis. He sees how I make him feel, when he's angry or he comes up from school and defeated, and I'm like, hey, let's talk about it. Let's go grab an ice cream. Those are the moments that resonate with him. And he's like, oh, and then helping him to understand that is the behavior he should be modeling with other people, because they go through the same thing. They have those same feelings. They have those same lives. And we may not be able to exactly understand what they're going through because they have a different perspective. But these are the ways in which you can show up for other people in your life and help them through it. And I think that is how we deal with it and counter it, is by the relationships we build with the men in our lives. And helping them to understand that it is okay to fail. It is okay to be a breaking point. It is okay to open up about the things that are going on in your life, and to share that, and to actually get that help and support from other people. Because I think it ties back into what you'd mentioned before about how, feminism has helped women to thrive. And a large part of that is because they have these strong interpersonal communication skills and strong networks of community, right? Women are exceptionally good at building community. Men are not. We're isolated, and we tend to keep isolated. And I think it's helping them to understand that isolation by itself is problematic, and getting them out of the spaces that simply reinforce the negativity and the hatred, because that just pulls them further down into that pit that they're not going to be able to climb out of.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of it, to me, from my perspective, it feels like so much of like the alpha male rhetoric and this sort of idea of idealistic masculinity stems from avoiding pain. Like we're all doing. And in order to step away from a lifestyle like that, or a belief about oneself like that, that means you have to make yourself vulnerable. That means you have to open yourself up to possibly being wrong, to possibly being made fun of, to being chastised, whatever, all the things that makes this world so cruel and painful. But it's through those things that you build lasting relationships, that you gain empathy, that you develop compassion, and all of the other things that are necessary for deep and meaningful relationships. And so this idea of, and I mean, I think you can see that in extreme radical feminism too, where, women are just like, I don't need anything and I don't need anyone. And it's basically just a woman's toxic masculinity that, is essentially, burn it all down, kind of thing, is not necessarily an empathic, thoughtful approach to a kind society. It's a wall against the evils of this world. But we're all still subject to those things, and that will never change. But yeah, it's definitely tantalizing in the short term.
It's the seduction of anything, right? Of creating that in group. And whether it is toxic masculinity, which decides that women are objects and don't deserve any empathy or compassion, whether it is the extreme radical feminism that says kill all men or hate all men, or I don't care if a man is suffering, right? Again, it's a denial of empathy and compassion to the other side. Whether it is, the anti-trans or the homophobia that comes out, or the white supremacists, like the same narrative time and time again. There's an in-group. We're good with our in-group. We don't need to display empathy or compassion for the out group. And it never ends well. It never produces good things. And it always just increases the amount of suffering and pain in the world. And I think that's something we should all be motivated to do as little as possible. We will do it. We will screw up and hurt people, but we should all be motivated fundamentally every day of how do I make the least amount of pain and suffering.
Just like how in the Barbie movie, the patriarchy was harmful, but so was the matriarchy of Barbie Land. They both didn't work out for true equality amongst the sexes. I just had to throw in a Barbie reference there.
I mean, we have
So-
to. And it's not our fault. It's just that Barbie continues to break box office records and smash the patriarchy in real and tangible ways
and is the
that we
most
have to continue to talk about it.
female-directed film of all time.
Yeah, it's not us bringing it up. This is what the world is talking about, people.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that got me about that movie is that is probably the most thoughtful and compassionate and kind view of essentially incel culture that has, I think, ever been portrayed in media. I think when you look at how kind it was to Ken and how it helped with Ken, and yet to see the backlash be that it hates men, kind of ties to what I was saying, because the moment you don't follow the narrative, then it's gone. But it should honestly be celebrated because again, it was just the kindest display of incel culture and how to deal with it that I think is fantastic. And I think if men could get past, it's talking about patriarchy and actually hear the message of Ken in there, I think that would, take great steps in helping those men to break some of the isolation and loneliness.
I mean, Ken has a backstory. He has an arc.
Yeah. Right. He has more than so many women in other movies have.
He passes the Bechdel test.
He does. And I mean, to say one more thing about Barbie is that I think a beautiful example of positive masculinity in Barbie is Alan. His character is he is not following the crowd. He's not following the horde mindset of the Kens. He is standing up for the Barbies. He literally beats up a whole group of Kens by himself. So he's tough. Alan might seem wimpy or whatever, but he's tough. Beats up all of these Kens. He is consistently the one who is sort of this beacon of true manhood, I would say. He's also the only one who's impregnated someone because Midge is technically his wife. So, and she's the pregnant Barbie. So that's very manly. Anyways, just saying.
Impregnating people, very manly.
I'm just saying, according to those men, I think according to certain men on the internet, that would be very manly. It's you procreate,
fertile.
Know?
Wow.
He's fertile.
Right.
So good.
Ken does not procreate with Barbie ever, purposefully. Barbie doesn't have children. So I'm just saying. Anyways, that's just a silly tangent, but
I had not heard that before. I'm stealing that. That's awesome. I've not heard that piece.
There's your next TikTok for you.
There you go.
Yes.
Alan is so manly, he can impregnate.
Alan and his seed. Yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah,
I'll
there
get
you
that past
go.
the community guidelines, but we'll try.
Yeah, you can figure it out. Censor some things.
Slightly tangential, but it's kind of interesting to me as we're talking about avoiding fear and pain, and I'm kind of connecting some dots. I'm currently taking a course to become a certified integrative trauma coach, which is really fun, and I'm learning all about trauma. And part of me is wondering if part of the reaction and the self-protection that we're seeing from men when we start to talk about things like patriarchy or toxic masculinity is we mentioned earlier that I could be a failure and not meet up to the message that I have been given by society or that by my parents or grandparents, what have you. And in a way, that is avoiding trauma. Maybe for a man, I don't know. I'm not a man, so I don't know. But if they've been told you must be right your whole life, and all of a sudden you are realizing I'm not right, that could be traumatizing. And trauma is not necessarily about the event. It is about how you process the event. And so we have a generation of men or multiple generations of men that are processing things like masculinity and patriarchy in a specific way. And if they're avoiding pain and fear, it's because they're avoiding trauma. And so I'm just thinking of all this from my now trauma-informed approach to as I'm learning, and I'm kind of this is all fascinating.
First off, that's really exciting, and I'm awesome to hear that you're doing that. I'm a manager in my day life, so I'm a coach, and a lot of my personal learning has been on that side of things of learning trauma, right? You have to be careful as a coach because you're not a therapist, so there's definitely a line of where you can get involved, but it helps inform so much of your relationships, your interpersonal relationships, because so many people do have trauma and seeing how that shows up. And our culture and our society now has got so much more informed about trauma and how, things can be activating to somebody and enhance their emotions. And so you might need to stay away from certain topics or behaviors and learning what those are with each individual. And I think you're right. I think, it was a great call that you said about like it's generational and multiple generations, because this did not start with this generation, right? And like you talked about, a lot of like even the men like my age will talk about their fathers and their grandfathers who would exhibit a lot of these toxic traits and the behaviors and especially the violence. And I think a lot of it, like as you start to like dig into the trauma side of it, a lot of it is about, I think it's called, somatic therapy technique or whatever. And it's that integration of emotions and the body. And what happens is, as a child, you experience these moments of intense emotionality. You're crying out for your needs to be met that don't get met. And so what your body learns to do is to just shut down, because that pain is too much. Your needs don't get met. So you just ignore it and shut it away. And I think that's what happens. And so when men are criticized, I think is the big one that really kind of activates a lot of men, is when they're criticized, it comes back to that pain of childhood, and they can't deal with those negative emotions that come out of it. And so they react in a very intense way of it. And it's difficult, it's difficult because men generally have a very dismissive attitude towards therapy and working through some of those things. In the conversations I've had with men, I've had a lot of people tell me that it's just, it's hookery. It's not serious. I don't want to go to therapy. They just talk. But it is super helpful and useful, especially in that integration of learning to experience emotions, to process them without necessarily reacting on them and acting out. And you would think that would be a masculine trait, because it almost kind of feels like stoicism in, having these emotions but not displaying them outwardly. And that would be something that men are very good at. But unfortunately, it seems that, for generations, men have been very bad at it. And I think playing into that is that stoicism aspect of it is a way to reach those men and say, hey, look, we should be able to experience emotions, not necessarily act on them, but take them in, collect them as data. It's information about your situation that you can use to inform a decision. You don't necessarily need to go swinging with your fists or punch a hole in the wall.
Absolutely. That's so cool. You're using like all the words that I'm learning about. My certification is threefold. It's somatics, breathwork, and meditation. And so learning about that activation and some of the violence that we are, I wouldn't say all, I would say there's plenty of violence from men that is meditated, but some of it could just be that activation of emotion that they need to release and they don't have the skills. And so many of us don't. Obviously, that doesn't dismiss the violence, but it is also like, that's interesting for me to think about.
It makes me think of the Prince Harry thing that you talked about.
Yeah. Have you seen the Candace Owens has a video where she makes fun of Prince Harry, where he's doing a butterfly technique is what it's called. And your arms are crossed and you're patting your shoulders slowly and gently. And she's like, this is an exercise that he learned from his therapist and la la la. So stupid. What a stupid, sensitive man. And I'm like, well, you actually, first of all, Candace Owens, I would claim you not to be trauma informed. But secondly, I'm like, if this is preventing Prince Harry from disassociating or from having a panic attack and staying grounded, that is an invaluable tool. Yeah. Especially to see someone as powerful and well-known as Prince Harry doing it something like that on a public platform, that's huge. Like, would I recommend that you break out your butterfly technique anytime you're in a meeting? Not necessarily, but if you need that tool in that moment, that is a brave decision for you to make.
So, Brent, to just like pivot slightly, I'm curious to hear some from you, because we talk about faith and religion a lot on this podcast. We all come from evangelical backgrounds where we've experienced various forms of trauma. It's very much informed our lives. I'm curious to hear from you as someone who is a professing Christian. Plot twist, surprise. How does your faith intersect with your work that is so feminist and progressive and inclusive when I would say a lot of people's perception of like the larger American Christendom is conservative and exclusive and sexist and just name all of the isms that you want to.
Yes.
So how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I'm mindful of, right? And it's one of the reasons why I'm not very open in terms of talking about it, because I know that just mentioning being religious can be very activating, especially for a lot of people who have been through that religious trauma, right? You don't want to hear from somebody who's religious because you know everything that's about to come out of their mouth. You've been told it 100 times before. So it is definitely something that I keep as a personal and private faith. And I think that's where really the work should be. I don't think it is a showy faith. In terms of how my faith informs me, for me, the stories that really always stood out are things like the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, the tax collector. These are all stories where they're invitations to listen, to open ourselves up to challenging our assumptions about what we think we know about a person based on perception or based on their reputation, and learning about their actual lived experience. And to me, that is the entire bedrock of which inclusivity and social justice and social reform are all based. And so I think that's where it all comes from for me in my faith. Is those have always been the stories that are important to me, of sometimes the work of faith, the work of being that inspiration or support to somebody is often just a conversation that is held in anonymity, right? I think about the moments in my life where I had a kind word from a stranger or from a friend or from a family member who really changed my life around or motivated me or gave me the strength to carry on. And it was those very simple conversations. Very rarely is it, somebody standing on a pulpit and telling you a chapter and verse, and then you're like, oh gosh, light bulb. Oh yeah, now I need to, change all the things. It's really showing up in the most basic human ways of just listening, of sharing that lived experience with another. There's a book that I really loved. It's by a guy called A.J. Swoboda. And the book is called Messy, God Likes It That Way. And it's all about how faith is just this convoluted, complex mess. And one of the things he talks about is that that our faith is a lot like taking the box of our most personal and private pain and then sharing that with somebody else and opening up and digging through and sharing that pain with somebody else in order to create a space where they feel comfortable taking their box and showing it to you. I'm getting all emotional about it, but one of the big turning points in my life was before we had my son, we had lost 2 pregnancies. And it is one of the most devastating things you can go through. Yeah. And I felt that as a man. To the mother of my child, it was so much more, because as a woman, you take it personally. What is wrong with me? What is wrong with my body? It is a much deeper wound and a deeper pain that she went through. And we would often have people come up to us, and when we'd had our son and say, when are you having another? Oh, is it time for a girl? And all this kind of stuff. And it was conversations that really hurt her because of all of that pain. And I just started just telling them, of saying, like, we lost 2 to get through this. And it wasn't necessarily to be mean. It was more to be factful, and it was more to help people understand that there's a story behind this. There is a lived experience here and that assumption. And I cannot tell you the number of times that just in having that conversation and talking about that, the other person we were talking to would then open up about, oh yeah, I lost a child too, or I had a miscarriage. And they would be there with their families. And like their families would be like, you've never told us this story.
Wow.
In that moment, they had opened up to a complete stranger and shared that moment of pain that they hadn't even shared with their families. And so like these are the things that I think about in my faith experience, of like the things that we go through, the pain and suffering that we experience are ways that we can bond ourselves and show community to others by being vulnerable, and by respecting the lived experiences and the stories of others, and by sharing those stories with others. And I think that is where I base all of this in. And this is why I'm motivated to say, okay, these might not be my issues. These may not be my experiences. These may not be my personal problems that I have to deal with day to day, but they are for the people that I live with, the people that I work with, the people that I am friends with. And it's important for me to be true to that faith, to speak to those stories and to listen and to educate myself, and be an advocate for, the people in my life. And I think that fundamentally is what we are called to do in our faith.
Very beautiful.
It is so beautiful. I think about Dan McClellan, who is a Bible scholar who talks a lot about how whenever anybody reads the Bible, they're making a negotiation. They are negotiating with their cultural context and with their own preconceived beliefs, and they are then interpreting the Bible through whatever that lens is.
Right.
And I think that is one thing that makes Christianity applicable across many different cultures and situations, and makes Christianity able to be very, very progressive and also very, very conservative. It depends on how you negotiate the Bible, and it depends on what lens you're reading it through. So, which we always are. So I think people often think of, no, the correct Christianity is like this like white American Christianity, and they dismiss something like queer theology or womanist theology or anything that feels off from that. But really, you are professing like, white American theology. And that, like, at the end of the day, this is a Middle Eastern first century book written in a patriarchy that has all these other cultural contexts that come with it. And we can't even begin to comprehend what it was even like to read that at that time. And so all that to say, I think it's beautiful to see the way that you've negotiated the Bible to apply to what you do. And I think that it's similar to the way that I also negotiate it, if you will. Yeah.
Well, and I think the danger is in the forgetting that it's a negotiation at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it is either read as an inerrant, easily understandable script based on any English translation that you may decide to choose from, that becomes problematic.
Mm-hmm.
When it is based on your ability to hear the audible voice of God in your life and make decisions based on that, it can be dangerous. But when we understand, I think the nuance of faith and the wrestling of faith, it becomes so much more, I guess, empowering and compassionate as opposed to domineering and power hungry. Well, and I wonder too, like, how does your perspective as a Christian inform what you do in terms of, I think typically if I were to meet someone such as yourself who was a Christian, or a Christian who was a content creator, I would envision a very different results in terms of the type of content that you create. So how does your faith specifically lead you to, or I mean, maybe not lead you necessarily, but how does it support the narratives and the topics that you choose to chase after?
And I think it comes to really like the whole motivation of how I started the account in the first place, which was seeing other people struggle, right? A lot of, like I said, my videos were about countering misogynistic talking points, because I would see other creators argue at length in their comments with these men who just would not relent, giving them false facts and making up statistics. And I was motivated to like, okay, I'm going to make like the one definitive video. Not that my videos are definitive. I'm not that arrogant. But I'm going to collect a bunch of stats to kind of like end this argument of Shay. Here's the proof that you're not talking. And so the other people could then tag them in my comments and then get on with their lives and not have to spend all this time. And I think it's that thing of, and this is a huge conversation that, has been going on TikTok this week, of if you see somebody in trouble or if you see somebody who needs a help and or assistance, you are called to step in and help and do what you can. And sir, that could be, you might put yourself in harm's way and step into an altercation, or if somebody's raising their voice, you need to maybe step in and mediate. It can be something as simple as, this is really where I feel like what I do on TikTok is less about wanting to be on a pedestal and oh, look at me, I'm doing great. It's more about, okay, here's a man who's speaking out, because I think the number of misogynistic men is very small. The number of men who are vocal allies is very small. I think most men live in this middle ground. And I think it's important for men to see other men normalize these conversations, normalize talking about it, normalize advocacy. Because then I think it helps them to feel like, oh, I can speak out in the same way that, talking about your pain could create a space for other people to be talking about their pain. Being open about your advocacy can then create a space for other men to be, that's good. And I'm seeing that a lot in like the men that I'm friends with and in, my quote unquote real life off the internet, they're seeing this and they're like, oh man, this is great that you're doing this stuff. And it's like, great, you need to be doing the same. Right. And they're starting to see that, oh, okay, like I should probably be stepping up and doing more and speaking out and being involved in these conversations, or at least being aware of the news, or at least talking to the other men that I work with and things like that. And I think that's really where it helps to inform and kind of is shaped by my faith. There's a quote I love, and I think it's misquoted to I think Francis of Assisi or something. I don't know who originally said it, but I love it. And it is, speak the gospel everywhere you go, use words if necessary.
Yeah.
That is where all of my motivation comes from is just ultimately be a good person. And I don't think you necessarily need to be motivated from a Christian perspective to be able to do that. I mean, whatever your faith experience or your spiritual experience is, I think all of us fundamentally want to believe that we are good people, want to act in a good way. I think the number of people who wake up every day wanting to be evil and bitter and twisted are very few. And it's often from, like we talked about, a trauma response from some of the pain they've gone in life. The vast majority of us want to be happy, healthy, and help others. And we love that feeling of making other people happy. And I think it's just more of that.
Love it.
All of us, I think, have been on this journey of renegotiating our faith. And we're all on different portions of that journey. And I'll say that there's no level of finality to any of it, because we're all still growing and changing. And it is always a comfort to me when I meet people who have found a way to choose compassion and faith together. Because the fundamentalist in me wants to believe that they are not compatible. In growing up in the church and having a dichotomy of right and wrong, and then leaving the church and still having that dichotomy kind of ingrained in how I think, but wanting to demonize Jesus, which is that's not the way forward. So it's always a good reminder for me. It's like a meditative practice to remind myself. Anyways, pivoting a little bit, one of the challenging things I think that we've come up against in having men on the podcast or having sound bites with men where we're having conversations is people are like, why is this man talking about this? This is, a woman should be saying these things. And the last thing we need is more white men speaking on women's behalf. Blah, 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 which...
Agreed.
Which, yes, absolutely. We're all in agreement on that. But I think it also, at the same time, still is valuable for men to be a part of the conversation. I think the thing that so much that we advocate for is to create space at the table for all voices, and more so equalize the influence and power that all the voices have so that everyone is represented fairly. And anyways, point being... how do you, as a male content creator talking about women's issues, create space for women in your work? Because that's a tricky balance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because especially, like you say, talking about a cishet man, the natural tendency is to talk over the top of everybody and explain everything and wade in. And I've seen a lot of other male creators that do that, right? They intense topics, and they're like, "Oh, just let me come in, I'll sort this out." And I think primarily you have to come from a place of, if you're going to talk about these things, be very clear on who your audience is and what your goals and where you're at. And I think for me, I have always wanted to try to reach men and try to turn men around, right? And I don't know if I'm terribly effective at it. I think most of my audience is female. So it's a struggle, but I think that's where I'm primarily motivated. Creating content that I talked about, share with my teenage son, that I think other people can share with, their husbands, their boyfriends, their children, and to try and motivate them, right? The motivation here is not to show what a great man I am or what a great ally I am. It's about creating that education. I think in how to create a space that is, safe for women and in this space, I think the biggest thing and the most obvious thing, and it sounds so dumb, but it gets overlooked so much by men, is just to listen. I think to come into it with humility, of realizing you're a guest in this space, that you don't have all the answers, and that you are there to learn primarily. That you are here to listen, to understand those lived experiences, and then to advocate for them. And that you don't necessarily have to understand. They don't have to make sense. You might be like, well, that doesn't seem right to me. I know, does not need to follow through. All you need to do is listen and understand, empathize, and then advocate. And I think that really is where I think a lot of men get into trouble. Is they want to come into a space, listen for a little minute, and then talk as an authority. And I think we've just got to be careful and always be mindful that we don't have all of the answers. And even in our own space, even in men's spaces, we don't have all the answers. Your experience is one of a number, right? It's like facets on a diamond, and everybody else has slightly different. And even though they may have lived the same experience as you, their outcomes, their experiences, and their views are going to be very, very different. And it's just always making sure that what you are trying to do is collect the broadest range of lived experiences you can to draw on, so that when you come to a situation, you can see it from all those different sides and perspectives, rather than just simply assume that you are always right, because most often you're not going to be. You have biases. You believe a bunch of things that are wrong. I know I do, right? And, the faith one might be one of them, right? Like, it might be one of those things that, oh no, for me, like, I have a very compassionate faith, but, from your experience, it's not been very compassionate. It's been very domineering and controlling. And so, like, understanding that there's no insult or pain or hurt, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's no conflict there between us, even though we have those differences, and not taking that criticism in that way. I think, again, that's the other big issue that we've seen a lot with male creators in feminist spaces, is the moment that they get called out, the moment that they are offered any criticism, like, their whole facade just crumbles, and they're like, well, these women, this is what they're like, and you're like, wait, what? Like, 2 minutes ago you were like this great feminist, and now you're back to these bloody women. Like, oh my God. And that happens a lot. I mean, like, there was a couple of months ago, I think there was like 4 or 5 feminist creators who just fell down that whole path because they couldn't take criticism.
Wow.
All from this place of, well, I'm an authority. Like, no, you don't have all the authority. None of us do. We are all learning. Like you said, our journey is continuing. And I think just remembering that. And I think the other thing to me is, like, the whole platform is a gift. It is not something that I feel like I deserve. Having a man talk on these things shouldn't need to be said. I think I'll be the first person to say that is a pointless account that isn't needed. And the moment that we don't need it, the moment that men will actively listen to women and hear these stories from women directly and don't need a man speaking and educating them, I will be extremely happy. I will delete that account and spend more time reading and drinking margaritas, probably.
Wow.
Amen to that.
Yeah. As someone who watches, like, most of your videos, there's so many instances where you will reference other female creators that have already answered questions you're being asked. You're like, just go listen to what they said, because they already did it. I don't need to repeat it. And where you highlight so many, like, other female TikTokers who are in that feminist space. And I think that's really valuable, in that you're using you've been given this bigger platform and you get to expose them to it. And I think that's incredible. Thanks for all that you do.
Well, again, but I mean, like, that's self-serving. Like, I built a community on TikTok, right, of my audience, but I've also built a community in that space of other feminist creators who are constantly educating me and helping me learn. So a lot of me shouting out is because, like, I have learned from these other creators. And I think we should be, like, being very open about, like, hey, like, I've learned this from somebody else. I did not know this. This is somewhere where I was ignorant until like 5 minutes ago, and they taught me about it. And I think, again, I think there's something really authentic about being honest in that journey of, I don't know everything. I am learning along the way, and these are the people I'm learning from, and you should too. And I think, like you said, if you've got a platform, I think it's, I don't know if your duty, but I think, like, there's something you're calling, you should be highlighting people who are smaller and helping them grow as well.
Well, I think that's great too, is this idea of giving other people kudos, not because, out of the goodness of your heart you want to elevate women's voices, but because out of an intent to listen and learn from other people, you have information to share. And I think that's a very different approach, or very different positioning.
I think it's very performative otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're just wanting to do it because, like, oh, here is a female voice. Like, it's performative. It's not real. It's not authentic.
Yeah. Well, Brent, we're coming towards the end of this episode and this wonderful conversation, but I have a couple more things that we need to tick off with you. First, I have a question that we ask every single one of our guests. It's a question that's very open to interpretation and open-handed, no wrong answers, but I want to hear from you. What does woman being mean to you? As a phrase, as a person, as a mantra. Take it as you will.
I love it. You're giving me very open and saying, yeah, there's no wrong answers. So let's prepare for the most wrong answer you have ever been given.
Unless you say, I don't know what, man.
Woman being is an evolutionary, reality where women are the gatherers and men are the hunters.
That would be wrong. Okay, I take it back. There are some wrong answers.
Let me think. I think, to me... I think the thing that comes instantly or most prominent to me is probably a possibility, right? Mm-hmm. I think, we were all birthed by a woman. We all were originally born women, or at least created women, until some hormonal switch flicked on in some of us to change things. And I think, when I think about, where we are right now in culture and in society, we are at a place where we have more technology than we've ever had. We have more medical advancements than we've ever had. And we have more social advancement than we ever have. And I think that defining role of a woman being outside of a human being or defining by itself is right now a place of the most limitless possibility and potential that I think we've ever had throughout history. I think it's incredibly exciting where we are. Yes, there's still a lot of work to do. There are still a lot of problems, but I think that is where I would look at it as it is such an open-ended thing today than it was maybe if we'd used the phrase 200 years ago. Sure. Right, woman being would be far more limiting. A woman being today is able to define her own narrative, write her own story, and I think there's very little you could take away from it. There's very little you can interpret on it because there is so much about it that is open and unanswered. And I think that's very exciting.
I love that. The possibilities are endless for the woman being. So, Brent, I know you mentioned earlier one resource, which is Messy, God Likes It That Way, I believe. But what other resources would you recommend to our listeners? Anyone who maybe wants to be more informed, if they want to know where the heck you get all of your useful statistics and data, which I very much appreciate that you include that in your work, or any other, what are some go-to resources that you would give out? Anything that you recommend?
So I think the one that cannot be stressed and used enough, and I'm sure you've heard this one before, is Lundy Bancroft's Why Does He Do That? I think that's an incredibly important book for men to educate themselves on why do they do that. I think that would probably be my big thing. Where I get my stats and stuff from is honestly just Google. And I think it's more about coming from a mindset of when you want to use statistics, when you want to prove a narrative, or you want to be right in a conversation. Don't look for that one line, that one stat that gives you right. Ask yourself the question, if it wasn't true, if I was wrong, what would that look like and what data would there be? And go look for that data. And if it's not there, then you can be more confident and, build up 2 or 3 sources to back your stuff. But I always start out by trying to prove myself wrong. I mean, that's how I ended up as a Christian, was I was a deeply militant atheist who wanted to prove that religion was nonsense and terrible. And so, I came up with, well, if it was true, then all these things would be true. And as I started digging, I was like, okay, this is not going well for me. And so I ended up there. But I think it's that open-mindedness that you should always approach things with, not just in making content and putting it into text, but even when you're having a conversation with another person. I think just always be open-minded to being wrong. Look for the evidence that you're wrong.
Oh, I think that is such a useful tool when it comes to just critical research and understanding how to attempt to move past your biases. Obviously, they will always impact what you're looking at, but I think that's so valuable. I want to internalize that myself and be okay, next time that I'm disagreeing with someone, consider that I'm wrong. It sounds so simple, but I think that that's such a great way to also just soften you to that possibility and to being less militantly, forcefully correct.
Because at the end of the day, think about how much better conversations would go as a whole if everyone came in with the assumption that they could be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's difficult. That's something to cultivate, you know? That's not something that we're just told, you might be wrong, all the time, So I think that's super valuable. Thank you for sharing that.
If you approach a conversation assuming that you're wrong, right? it's a great thing because you're going to learn something. If you approach a conversation and you're right and you already know everything, you walk away from that conversation having learned nothing. So it's actually a detriment against you. It's why I love surrounding myself with people who are smarter than me. I love being the dumbest person in the room. And also, like, I've lived with myself for 42 years. I'm a functioning idiot. I've seen how I live my life every day, right? Like I know who I am at this point.
Well, we did not perceive you as an idiot throughout this conversation.
Not one bit.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your insight and wisdom and just like allowing us to pick your brain about all of this a bit. I hope that this conversation is a great resource for people around the ins and outs of, toxic masculinity and why it is that a lot of this messaging has become so pervasive nowadays, and how a little bit of how we can start to like try to move forward and try to keep pushing towards a more just and equitable society, which I think we all want. I hope that we all want. But Brent, could you tell the people where to follow you? How can people find you if they don't already know about you?
Where
give
I'm
it to
at.
us.
Yes. No, absolutely. So I'm on TikTok as ex.patriarch. And also I think Instagram where it's like ex.patriarch instead.
Yeah, I think so.
There's a very rarely updated YouTube channel, but I think the big thing right now is the podcast that I'm trying to get started next month. We got some really good conversations to things about like domestic violence from a male perspective, which is a conversation I've been wanting to have so much on my TikTok, but it doesn't really work there because so many people want to weaponize it against women and talk about that when we talk about male victims of domestic violence. So I think this is going to be an incredible conversation to have. And the website for that is menaren'tok.com. And that is where we will be pushing our episodes as of, like I say, next month. We're starting to record in a couple weeks. So it's exciting.
So excited.
Congratulations. I can't wait to like and subscribe.
Yes. As people who intimately know the amount of work that goes into starting a podcast and keeping it running, well done already on the work that has been done.
Yeah. If you could probably wait until like I've got like 5 or 6 episodes. I don't think I necessarily need this is terrible.
No, I'm sure it'll be great.
And I will be having some very, very smart women on as guests. And so they will hopefully do all the heavy lifting.
They're going to make you look good, just like our guests make us look good.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, Brent. To the woman beings out there, make sure you also follow us if you're not already. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher, we're on Amazon Podcasts or Audible or whatever they're calling that currently. We're on YouTube. We're on TikTok. We're on Instagram.
We're on Threads.
We're on Threads, kind of. Barely. We're barely on Threads, honestly.
Most people are barely on
We're
Threads.
hanging on by a thread on Threads. But you can follow us there too. Maybe if more people followed us, I would feel more motivated for us to post on there. Anyways, be sure to give us a follow on there. We have exciting things happening in this new season. It's an abbreviated season. Is that the right?
Yeah.
It's a smaller season than normal, but we're so stoked because we have so much great content that we want to put out for y'all. Great conversations. We thought we would run out of things to say, but we haven't yet. So here we are.
4 years in.
And again, follow Brent. Thank you again, Brent. You're incredible. And we are going to wrap up this episode right now.
Bye.
The end.